Thank you for joining us for another Prophetic News Update, where we actually bring you the top headlines of the day and the uncensored topics that we believe that you need to know about. And that's actually what I ask you again today, for you to think to yourself, what is going on with the war in Ukraine and Russia right now? How did they get to this point? And what is the history? Stay with us and let's explore that question together. First off, let's start with the very obvious, with the Russian-Ukrainian war and how it's actually playing out and what the headlines actually are today. And of course, those headlines are Vladimir Putin is invading Ukrainian space and the border of Ukraine, and basically the Ukrainians are fighting back to keep and protect their country, making sure that they protect their sovereignty and their freedom. And that's actually what everybody is rooting for. Everybody likes to root for the underdog, of course, the underdog being Ukraine against the big bad bully of Russia, who has invaded the Ukraine. Now, let's get one thing straight. We have no dog in this fight. I have no dog in this fight. I'm not rooting for Russia. I'm not rooting for the Ukraine. I'm merely trying to provide information for a better understanding so that we can avoid war, and especially nuclear war, at all costs. Understand that and remember that, please, when you hear this information. But first off, let's understand what happened just a few weeks ago before this war got started, and how there were peace talks that were being held between the Russia and Ukraine, in which Vladimir Putin was demanding only two things. And that was, number one, that the Ukrainian government and Ukraine itself to remain neutral and stay out of the hands of NATO and any sort of NATO agreement. And number two was the fact that the Ukraine was accepting foreign weapons from various countries across the world, including the United States. Now, as you can see, of course, this is going to provide tensions between the two countries, especially when you understand the history of the country of Russia and the Ukraine since 1945, back in World War II, when the German forces actually were moving through Poland and Belarus, Ukraine, all at that point in time. That was where the Russian forces had actually stopped the Nazis, which was right there around the Ukrainian-Russian border. But they did not eliminate them altogether. There were still Nazi factions that actually remained around, especially when you do the history of understanding Operation Paperclip and how certain forces and certain Nazi forces were still allowed to be of some strategic significance for the U.S. and to retain the Nazi forces in that area. And again, at this point, I would actually encourage you to do the history of a man called Stefan Bandera, and who actually was one of the leaders of the remaining Nazi forces that actually remained in the Ukraine at this particular point in time and led Nazi movements to stay rooted within Nazi culture. Now, again, sparing you a long history lesson of everything that had particularly happened from 1945 up until now, let's go back to what has recently happened back in 1991, when the Ukraine actually gained its independence. Now, without going into too much detail in the history of who Vladimir Zelensky actually is, as far as for him being a Russian television person, to various videos that are on the internet that are explaining exactly what he did before the presidency, are not necessarily irrelevant, but they are interesting to understand. Now, one of the main points of interest is actually what the geographic and strategic locations of the Ukraine and Russia actually are. The main point of interest is actually lies in Crimea and how it's situated between the two countries, especially with the Russian forces actually controlling Crimea and its actual entrance into the Black Sea via the Kerch Strait. So the Russians controlled that area that was leading into the Black Sea. And when the situation happened where there were Ukrainian ships that were actually entering into the Black Sea, and they were actually carrying with them weapons and foreign weapons, we'll say, they were actually turned away and they were not allowed to enter the Black Sea carrying those foreign weapons that was going to be put on the border of the Ukraine and Russia. And when they were turned around and sent back, there was a skirmish that happened in the sea, and there was a Russian boat that rammed a tugboat. And now, on their way back from being turned away and their entrance being denied into the Black Sea, the Ukrainian boats actually turned back, and there was a skirmish that happened in the sea where two of the boats, both a Russian boat and a Ukrainian boat, ended up running into each other, which caused a larger escalation in which Russian planes were actually then scrambled, and the boats that the Ukraine had the weapons on, those boats were actually fired on by Russian airships. Now, again, at this point in time, I ask you to understand that each one of these moves that are strategically being done are putting more and more arms on the Ukraine border to defend itself against Russia. But again, that would be like Russia sending, missiles to our doorstep to Cuba and other nations that were arming Cuba. The U.S. would absolutely have to act in its own best interest and self-preservation to guard against any weapons that are coming into that area and building up any sort of either defensive or offensive position for a first strike. What do you think the U.S. would do? Well, in our conventional sense of the United States, we would definitely beef up our military. We would send them directly to all of our borders and be guarding all of the straits and all of the seaports and the waters to help defend our country. And it also expands the scope of a worldwide war, which is actually what they're after. And that's what we need to fight against. Arming yourself with information can help prevent this from happening. Arming the enemies of a nuclear capable country, again, the largest in the world, is not a good plan because it's mad. It is going to ensure mutually assured destruction if this continues to escalate and get out of hand. Because the more and more players that join against Russia to try to eliminate Russia, then increases the chances of worldwide nuclear war. And this is what we need to stay away from at all costs. Again, tonight we actually have the State of the Union address that's about to be given to us by Joe Biden. And it's going to be important that you understand in what to watch because he's going to muster support to invoke Article 5 and actually go to war. But again, this is something that we need to stay away from. Please, there are no sides in thermonuclear war. This is mad. It is and will ensure mutually assured destruction. There are no sides. I'm not on the side of Russia. I'm not on the side of Ukraine. I'm only on the side of truth and trying to give people the best opportunity to understand information and to actually make the best decisions possible from that point. Again, I want to thank you guys for listening. Once again, everything's going great on the podcast and on the website. Thank you again for your support, and stay tuned for these messages, and we will see you later. The darkest reaches the truth, hard to speak it, but you know that I just don't care. I got to get my message across to my people that might be lost everywhere. Just to let you know, you got a higher purpose that serves you, but you got to let self go.